I'm going to be looking at a couple of passages that you may want to flip to. The first is Matthew 5:10, and the second will be Revelation 7. So we have been at Christian Life Center. Pastor Randall has been leading us through this series on the Sermon on the Mount, and we've been focusing on the Beatitudes. And so just to kind of remind you some of the things that we've been talking about to bring you up to speed is that the Beatitudes is an opening of one, possibly the most consequential sermon that's ever been preached. So a famous sermon of Jesus that's recorded for us in the Gospel of Matthew. And the Beatitudes are these opening statements where Jesus is declaring blessed those people that we would often think are down and out or forgotten, or those who are weak. And Jesus is saying that now in the kingdom of God that he both embodies and proclaims that these people who are often forgotten, marginalized, suffering, that they are the ones blessed. And they are blessed because of Jesus, because the kingdom of God is coming, because it is at hand. And in that kingdom, these are the ones, not the ones that we commonly think have the best life, or the ones that we look that are super rich or whatever, but these are the ones that Jesus points out to say that they are blessed. And in Matthew 5:10, which is one of the Beatitudes we looked at this week, Jesus says this. He says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And then he continues in verse 11 and 12. He says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Now, this statement is very counterintuitive for us today and in the culture we live in. Jesus is saying that those who experience suffering because of righteousness, those who suffer because of their identification with Jesus, that they are blessed. Now, we live in a society and in a culture where suffering is like a 4-letter word, right? Like, we're constantly encouraged to go after what makes us feel good. We're constantly encouraged to get the latest item that's going to increase our comfort, that's going to increase our happiness, it's going to increase our well-being. And so in the same way, our culture shapes and forms us and encourages us to shun that which feels bad, to avoid pain at all costs, to avoid finding ourselves in conflict situations and in positions where we may experience suffering. But Jesus here in these counterintuitive statements is saying, blessed are those who suffer, who are persecuted because of righteousness, and blessed are those who suffer for identifying with Jesus. Now, part of that blessing is that when we suffer for a righteous cause, when we suffer for identifying with righteousness, when we suffer for identifying with Jesus, there we are experiencing some of what Jesus did. And the church has a long history of understanding, a long history of saying that martyrs, those who throughout history have lost their lives because of their association with Jesus, they have kind of this special place, this special identification with him, because Jesus, we know, suffered tremendously for preaching the good news. He even lost his life and was beaten and forsaken. And so when we experience those things, in some ways we are identifying closely with Jesus' own story. And we know that there are people all around the world, those brothers and sisters of Christ of ours, who are suffering for his cause tremendously. I know at times you hear people in the country where we're at in the United States say that, we feel like persecution's coming, and perhaps things are more difficult for us today than they were a few years ago. I can't really speak to that. But I do know that we do have brothers and sisters who are literally putting their lives on the line for the sake of proclaiming the good news of Jesus that brings those who are far away close to God. And I believe that God has a special blessing and a special grace for them who face that. But when we face discomfort, when we face suffering in the little ways that we do here, that there's a blessing for us when we identify with the suffering that Jesus has experience. Now, the second reason I think the blessing comes is for the Christian faith. For us, righteousness and suffering, both of these things, we understand them in context of what God is doing throughout history. So we don't just have these isolated incidents where we're hurting. So any pain that we experience, we can understand that pain in light of the end, in light of what God is ultimately doing in this world, in the righteousness that God is ultimately seeking to establish. And a beautiful example of that complete context is the entire letter of Revelation that the Apostle John writes to several churches at that time. Now, just a couple quick notes about Revelation, because this, to me, for many people, this is a difficult portion of the Bible to try to understand, to try to crack. It can be very intimidating because it sounds and looks different than most of what you may read throughout the rest of the Bible. But it is a beautiful thing when you take the time and you can study and begin to kind of understand what John is communicating. So just three quick things I want to say that up front, if you're going to read Revelation, I think these are the things that you need to keep in mind. The very first one is that Revelation's intention, we need to think about the overall intention of it, and I think it is to show us Jesus. That John tells us that he has this vision of Jesus, and now he is relaying that to the church. So before we start putting up our maps of what we think the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 6 years are going to look like, the very first thing we need to do when we're approaching Revelation is to recognize that this is going to show me something about Jesus. The second thing, and really these are the second thing that John is trying to do is to communicate something about Jesus, but he's also trying to communicate and encourage faithfulness. So he is writing to a group of churches that are facing a variety of issues at their time. Many of them are suffering very literal physical harm because of their identification with Christ. They are literally being persecuted for the cause of righteousness and for the sake of Christ. And he is writing this as an encouragement to say, like, hey, like, stick it out. Don't quit. Remember they did this to Jesus. Remember he said this would come. And to give them a picture of how God in the end will redeem that suffering and how God in the end will win out against the forces of evil that are causing not only their suffering, but all the suffering and all that is wrong in the world. And the last thing that I want to point out that we need to keep in mind when we're reading Revelation is that part of it is to warn against falling away. To warn believers who are facing difficult times or who are facing false teachings to be careful not to give up prematurely, to stick it out, because we know that ultimately Jesus is going to return and that he will set all things right. And so when we're reading Revelation, first of all, it's communicating to us something about Jesus. It is encouraging those who are going through difficult times to be faithful, and it's warning all of us to beware of false teachings and of just giving up when things get tough. Now, very specifically, to bring it back to our conversation about blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, there is this beautiful image in Revelation chapter 7. And it tells us, beginning in verse 9, that John looks and he sees this multitude that has gathered around the throne of God from every nation, and they're dressed in white robes, and they're crying out, and they're in a loud voice saying, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." So we see this group that represents the entirety of the world. They are there worshiping God and praising God in his very presence. And John is asked kind of like a rhetorical question, like, hey, who do you think these are? And then John tells the person who asked them this, he says, you know. And they are identified this way in verse 14. It says, these are those who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And it continues in verse 15. It says, therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So anytime we are facing suffering or hardship in this world, I think we need to, as followers of Jesus, put that in the context of what God is ultimately trying to do. And know that our suffering on this world will not be in vain, and it will not last forever. And when we suffer for righteousness, that God will use that as seeds for what he wants to do in his kingdom, to spread his gospel, and ultimately to bring about the end that he has appointed for this world. And that is for, as we see in the very end of Revelation, for God to be present with his creation, with his people, for there to be nothing in between them, and for all to experience life as he has intended it. And so the persecuted those who take up the righteous cause and are persecuted, those who suffer for identifying with Jesus, they are blessed. They are blessed not because we're trying to say like, oh, like it doesn't kill you, it's good for you, and all that kind of stuff. No, we're saying these are very real hurts, and in many cases they're wrongdoings. But ultimately, we can situate all of that within the context of what Jesus is doing, what God is doing in this world to establish righteousness, and what he's ultimately going to do to redeem suffering, to redeem hurt, and to bring all of us into the fold of this multitude that stands before the throne and declares the salvation of God. So thanks so much for joining today. I hope you have a great day.